Okay, so this is a presentation that I will be giving at the Alderney History Symposium in the UK, in the Channel Islands. And what this presentation is actually about is trade defense in the English Channel during the First World War. And this is a fascinating but incredibly complicated topic. And so I want to sort of do a dry run so you can see what it's all about. Now, I'm just going to be lecturing, you won't be able to see the notes. That's going to be fine though. Because, like I said, this is just a dry run, and just trust me, the notes are quite good. So anyway, alright, so what is going on here? Well, the British Empire imports an awful lot of goods. They're trading from all over the world. Now, although they used to be known earlier in the 19th century, the British Empire was or Britain specifically, was the workshop of the world, where one of the first countries to industrialize, and most of the world's manufactured products were made in Britain. Now, as the 19th century went on, of course this changed, and the other nations industrialized and caught up. Obviously America, the rest of Europe, especially Germany, and so they have all sort of caught up with Britain as we go into the 20th century. So Britain's relative lead in industrial technology is declining. However, they still have quite a lead in terms of not only financial power, banking, financial instruments, but also in terms of their raw military power. So they don't have a very large army, but they don't need one because they have a very powerful navy, a very modern and powerful navy, which had been specifically modernized during the tenure of Admiral Sir John Fisher when he was the first Sea Lord up until, I believe it's about 1910. And then now of course the Liberal Party under H.A. Asquith has come in and replaced the Conservatives who had been in power under Arthur Balfour. And Balfour, of course, was the nephew of Lord Salisbury. So the Conservatives have been in power for quite a long time, and they've now been swept out of power by the Liberals. And so the Asquith picks Winston Churchill to become First Lord of the Admiralty. And so Churchill is brought in to cut down expenses and to continue this modernization program. Now, so one of the things that they're exceptionally worried about before the war is how are they going. There's two things really. And how are they going to defend the British Empire, which is huge, and covers a quarter of the surface of the earth, it's spread out all over the world, and is connected by these naval sea trade routes, routes of communication. So how are they going to protect that empire is a big problem, and also how are they going to keep naval costs down? Because the best way to protect the empire is to make sure the navy is well financed and up to date. But the naval costs are spiraling out of control because the new technology is very expensive, and also there are all these challenges to the new technology coming into play, like the submarine and the torpedo, mine warfare, and of course the aircraft. Zeppelins have been invented in Germany. Blériot has flown across the English Channel. So there's a lot of concern about what the future of imperial defense is going to look like and how they're going to regulate it. Now, the trade system that the British Empire relies on is a laissez-faire system. It's built upon unlike earlier in the 18th century, the 19th century model was based simply succeeding because of the security that was provided by the Royal Navy. So the Royal Navy its dominance was so overwhelming that no one could possibly contest it, which meant that Britain could do a couple of things. It could go around the world and coerce people to do business with it, like they had done in South America. This is famous kind of informal empire. Something that, of course, was not British enough monopoly on, since the Americans did the same thing in Japan and in China and elsewhere. So you've got, on the one hand, that coercion dynamic. Now, on the other hand, it means that Britain's trade is just kind of inherently protected because the Navy exists. So anybody who tries to challenge them will have to go through the Royal Navy, and it's nobody can do this. However, as we know, in the early 20th century, the challenge is changing. The French and the Russians have built new armored cruisers. They're developing better, like I said, submarine technology. The Germans are catching up, and they're building a big, under Tirpitz, or the Navalaw, they're building a big German battle fleet. So they're coming to challenge them. So what happens during the war, which is what this presentation is actually about, and specifically about trade defense in the Channel, is that when the war starts, the British have set up, Nicholas Lambert did a lot of work on this, controversial work, I would add, but they've, his book is right here, Planning Armageddon. This is the famous conspiratorial volume, 600 pages long, etc. But he lays out the sort of financial preparations that the Admiralty was making for when the war started, because they expected what would happen is that there would be chaos, right? As like Norman Angell had predicted, these big industrial powers, and they're fighting with each other. It's going to disrupt the world markets. It's going to cause the shipping lanes are going to get interdicted by cruisers. The British and the Germans, pretty much everybody's planning on doing this. They've got these these nice luxury liners that have been built by the Cunard and the White Star Line are prepared to be co-opted by the Admiralty so that they can go be used as interdiction cruisers to go raid merchant routes. Okay, so the Admiralty is preparing, the British Admiralty is preparing to confront, in the event of a war with the continental power like Germany, what they're preparing to do is to cut them off and isolate them financially and in terms of their transoceanic communications. So specifically what they want to do is what they do end up doing, and Arthur, I think it's A.C. Bell, the blockade of Germany. So this is quite a huge volume by Bell. Again, 800 pages long with very thorough variations of imports and exports, all the kind of nitty-gritty technical details that you just love reading about in terms of deconstructing trade in an era that no longer exists. But this is what the British are planning to do, which is to use their diplomatic and financial power through a treaty framework, to cut off Germany and the Central Powers, that's Austria-Hungary and later Turkey, to cut off their access to trade, because they know through the system of the treaty framework that's been developed during the 19th century, the Declaration of Paris and Declaration of London, which the British wanted to kind of control, but were not able to get it exactly the way they wanted it. It would be very controversial to start just completely cutting off a country's trade. In fact, it's very hard to do, especially with a continental power like Germany, because there's continuous voyage and overland routes, and they can trade bring it through the Mediterranean, and come through the north, and so and if you start trying to cut off everybody's trade, this is going to be very unpopular. So the British do set up the famous 10th Cruiser Squadron based out of Liverpool, and it goes up to the north and cuts off the trade access through the North Sea to Germany. And so that's quite a blow to German trade. Now, of course, the Germans send out cruisers, and they've got von Spee in the South Pacific, and with the Scharnhorst and the Gneisenau, and they've got they're doing some interdiction. The Dresden and Königsberg. They have all these light cruisers and auxiliary cruisers that are out there. Those quickly get wrapped up by the Royal Navy. They destroy them and they blockade them in various battles. The treaty framework then goes into play, and that begins to cut off Germany's access to trade. Now that is going to it's going to take a little while, of course. This is the classic thing Julian Corbett said about naval warfare. Maritime war is that the blockade strategies take a long time to get going, to have an impact, but when they do, it's very profound. So the British can guarantee that they're going to cut off, through this treaty framework in the 10th Cruiser Squadron, they're going to cut off Germany's access to supplies. Now, like I said, this will take a while. And so in the meantime, now the Germans, of course, they know this, and they're concerned about the impact this will have on their war effort. So what they do is they decide, of course, they have to respond somehow, and so they set up in February 1915, they set up the war zone around Britain, and they decide to use their submarines which this was again very controversial because the submarine, although it had scored a number of U-boat specifically, scored a number of important victories against British surface assets, such as the famous Hogue, Cressy, and Aboukir event when U-9 torpedoed 3 old armored cruisers in one day, right? Like that's pretty powerful. The British lost HMS Formidable, torpedoed, the HMS Hermes, protected cruiser, torpedoed. So anyway, so the Germans are inflicting, the submarines are inflicting a lot of losses, attritional losses on Britain's warships. However, the German Admiralty is now thinking, okay, we're going to use these submarines to attack British merchant trade. And again, this is going to be a very delicate thing to do because this is what, again, Julian Corbett talked about quite a bit. If you go back and look at the 19th century and earlier, it's one thing to capture somebody's trade and then have it go through a prize court system and hand out award prize law and things like this. It's quite another to just go out onto the sea and just arbitrarily sink it. In fact, this is the equivalent of it's considered to be the equivalent of piracy. And so some hardliners in the British Admiralty, including Fisher and Percy Scott, had sort of thought this was probably going to happen. But even then, it would be so, actually doing this, just going out and sinking merchant shipping, is potentially, and Julian Corbett was very clear about this is very dangerous, because if you start sinking other people's merchant shipping, well then they're going to go to war with you, and so you're going to make more enemies, and the retaliation will be so intense that it will be ultimately detrimental to you. So now the Germans think initially that they can just kind of possibly cripple the British by sinking parts of their shipping. This is all part of their post-Schlieffen Plan strategy, because the Schlieffen Plan was such a disaster, unfortunately for them, so they have to come up with something. So they're thinking, we have to get Britain out of the war. Right? So they set the war zone. Now the war zone, this first phase, so-called first phase of unrestricted submarine warfare, doesn't last very long because, of course, what immediately happens is they sink U-20 torpedoes the Lusitania on May 7th, 1915. And Lusitania is a huge, it's like 45,000 ton, similar in scale to the Titanic or Olympic passenger liner, and they kill a number of Americans and other people just doing this. And so this is very controversial. They do this again when they torpedo the Arabic in August 1915. So these are like diplomatic incidents, and they produce reactions from the neutral powers, especially the Americans, who are not happy with the British blockade, but they're certainly not happy about having their citizens killed in U-boat sinkings, right? So the Germans said, okay, the Kaiser approves, he said, we got to curtail this submarine warfare. This is not the best idea. Now, but they still have, so they pull back on the submarine warfare, but they're in a real tight spot, as George Clooney would say, in Oh Brother Where Art Thou, but they're in a really difficult spot here, because strategically the North Sea access is cut off by the Royal Navy, and the Dover Strait, in this case to what I'm really talking about, which is the English Channel, has been cut off by the Dover Patrol under Vice Admiral Richard Bacon, or at least he's trying to cut it off. So this means that the Germans have this large fleet, the High Sea Fleet, I think it's the second largest battle fleet in the world, and they can't do anything with it. It's caught in their fleet base at Wilhelmshaven. Now the fleet base is protected by minefields. The Germans are mined. The North Sea is covered in mines. The British and the Germans are mining it, and so that protects the High Sea Fleet from attack from the British, from the Royal Navy. Because of course, what the British would like to do is Copenhagen, as Fisher would put it, based on the famous Battle of Copenhagen, in which Lord Nelson captured the entire Danish surface battle fleet. So what they would like to do is go to the harbor with their forces, capture the harbor, or torpedo and sink the High Sea Fleet in harbor. And if they can do that, that means it would open up all kinds of strategic options, because then they could possibly go land in the Baltic, or they could capture Heligoland, the same Churchill wants to do. So there's all these, it would open up all these strategic dimensions, and it would certainly release a lot of their forces, because suddenly they'd have this, the Grand Fleet under John Jellicoe would now have nobody to block, nobody to counter. So it would be free to go do all kinds of things, support the Dardanelles landing, whatever. Anyway, so that's what the strategic situation looks like. And so the Germans are in a bind. They have to do something about they feel like they've got this great asset, the High Sea Fleet. They can't use it, right? So eventually what they do is they decide to go, when Ludendorff gets in, after Falkenhayn resigns because of the failure of the Verdun campaign, Ludendorff decides, okay, we're going to go back to unrestricted submarine warfare. They're going to accept the risk because the chief of the Admiralty staff, whose name is Hotzendorf, is telling them that he calculates that if they sink 500,000 tons of British merchant shipping a month, and they do it for something like 6 months, it will bankrupt the United Kingdom. They will be, their merchant their merchant fleet will be destroyed, and they'll be forced to retire from the war. Now, it turns out he's totally wrong, and again, this is a really bad move, ultimately, that they make. This is a terrible decision, strategically. But anyway, they decide they're going to do it. So they cut the U-boats loose. Now, they've got some problems. They don't have enough U-boats to actually pull this off. And yes, as soon as they start sinking everybody's merchant shipping, the neutrals go nuts, and then the Americans, in April 1917, declare war on them. And this is a game loser. You lose the war because of this. But they're trying. So they're trying to sink all of the merchant shipping that's approaching Britain. They're trying to strangle Britain. And it is, in a way, working. Because if they can do it long enough, the Admiralty, who's now led by John Jellicoe as First Sea Lord, and the Admiralty staff has done the calculations, and they know that Britain has about 16 million tons of merchant shipping. And they've gained a little bit more because they've been building more, and they've captured a bunch of German merchant ships as well, so on. But they've got allies. The French obviously allied with them, the Russians, and so on. So they have more than 60 million tons. But of that 16 million, they need 8 million for the Navy and the Army. So 4 million just to supply the BDF in France, and the other operations they're running, like in Salonika in Mesopotamia, and the operations in Mesopotamia. And then, so you need about 8 million tons there, 4 million for the Army, another 4 million for the Navy, just to run the war effort. One of the things they're doing is they're shipping a lot of coal to France because all of the French coal fields have been occupied by the Germans. So to keep France in the war, they need British coal, which means it has to be shipped across the Channel. So then on top of that, they need another 8 million tons for the civilian population. That's just your food supply, right? And all imported goods. So it sort of could work. If the Germans could sink, and this is what the Admiralty has actually calculated, they know this, if they sink up to 8 million tons, that means, since they can't cut back on the shipping they're using for the war, it means they will then have no shipping left for the civilian population, which means the civilian population will starve. And so they figure, okay, that will lose. And they think it's going to take a while, because at the rate, this is based on calculations that they're doing in April. April is when the crisis is at its absolute worst. And so they're sort of projecting, if those loss rates keep up, then we're going to be in real trouble. And they know that's going to happen. The real crisis point will be it won't be in 1917, but it will be in like the second half of 1918. And so they're thinking by it's late 1918, but they think by that point they will lose the war. Now this is Lloyd George, who's the Prime Minister now, thinks this is the former Minister of Munitions, running this liberal conservative coalition government. He thinks that Jellicoe is just being a pessimist. Lloyd George is kind of an optimistic guy, so he's not too worried about this. But Jellicoe's got a point, and it's that if the Germans can keep up this rate of sinking, then the British Empire is going to be in real trouble. And so they're very worried about this. Now, Lloyd George, like I said, he's not terribly concerned about this, and he's actually right not to be, because, like I say, there's no way the Germans can actually do this. They don't have enough submarines. The crews are exhausted. They go in April. They put in their maximum effort, as they say, in like high noon, and so they're 12 o'clock high. Yeah, so they're exhausting their submarine crews doing this. And also the thing is, they're just sinking a lot of everything. So they're sinking sailing ships and fishing boats. And it's like, these are not going to decisively impact the war. You need to sink, troop ships. Like the Americans are going to start sending their army to France, right? Those are going to come through Britain. So you got to sink those troop ships. Well, the British implement a convoy system. and they do it in the Atlantic, and they start getting very comprehensive about this. So what you start seeing is that there's a action-reaction taking place here, which is actually fascinating, and it's much more interesting than anything else that's happening in naval war. So, like, there's this obsession with the Battle of Jutland and, Heligoland Bight and the Dogger Bank and so on. It's like, these are nice little, actions, whatever. But the thing is, why are they, what do they actually matter? They change the strategic dimension. And the answer is they don't. This, however, does, or at least could, have. And so it's much more interesting to examine in that regard. Now, so initially what the British have done is they've set up their trade protection system to protect against these merchant raiders. Because again, going back to the beginning of the war, what they're worried about is, and this is all covered in this great series by Ernest Failly, The Seaborne Trade. This is the third volume, 3 volumes of this. And he talks, he goes into excruciating detail about how the British have set up their merchant trade system and what they're worried about and what the Germans are trying to do and so on. But, so what the Germans are trying, initially, what they're going to do is use these auxiliary cruisers to interdict Britain's oceanic communication lines. So the British Admiralty, in response to that, set up this approach system where they have different parts of the English coast sort of sectioned off, and they patrol those lightly and then switch them randomly. So the idea is that any raider would have difficulty, they might get lucky and catch a couple of ships, but they're going to have difficulty knowing where the ships are going, what their destination is, and so on. And so this system initially kind of works. The British are taking, in all of the attritional aspects of the war, they're taking small losses, for a while, up until 1916, and then it starts, like I said, when the submarines get unleashed, it gets really bad in 1917, because this trade approach system, designed to protect against merchant cruisers, actually funnels all the shipping into these approach lanes. So all the submarines have to do is just go sit on the approach lanes, and they're guaranteed to get targets, right? And also, there's a lot of congestion around the Plymouth area, specifically, because that's where most of the shipping is getting located to, that coast of the Cornish coast of England there. Now, there's cross-channel shipping happening from France, like I said, coal trade there. Now, the British have, so what they do, initially Jellicoe is a kind of a laissez-faire guy, and he lets the districts just kind of handle, these are the local naval districts in England. England is divided into a whole series of local naval commands. He just lets them handle this problem. And so the commander at Portsmouth, who is Stanley Colville, sets up a cross-channel convoy system, which is called protected sailings, to cover the coal that's going across the channel, and of course the supplies for the BDF. That's a very, very successful system. In fact, it's so successful that when the British naval staff started studying it, they realized that they could implement a convoy system across for all of their traffic. Why not? We should do it for the Atlantic. This is where we're having all these shipping losses in the Atlantic. So if we set up a convoy system there, we'll solve that problem. Now, initially, Jellicoe is skeptical because they don't have enough. He thinks they don't have enough destroyers. They do have a lot of destroyers in the Grand Fleet, but if you move them out of the Grand Fleet and then you have to go fight the Germans, and the Germans have submarines in the North Sea, you're going to be in trouble with your fleet. And if you lose the Grand Fleet, you lose the war too. So what do? Now, what they do is they start building, they carry on this building program that Fisher had implemented when he got into power as First Sea Lord in October 1914 with Churchill, because he was preparing for this Baltic campaign. And so they were going to build all these landing craft and monitors and this huge building campaign. This was all part of he was really implementing the flotilla defense program that he had believed in going back to the early 20th century. And so now he's doing it, he's implementing that. And this it means you have to have a lot of small ships to protect your merchant traffic and to do amphibious landings, things like this. So they have that building program going. Jellicoe accelerates it. He also starts building more mines and depth charges so that they can you need a weapon to attack the submarines, right? So they're developing these countermeasures. But that's going to take a while. And so while they're doing that, the best thing they've got are these kind of tenuous convoy routes. And they're working. They're doing other things. They're training up the merchant crew. They're arming the merchant ships. They've got Q ships are out there and so on. They're building a lot more merchant shipping to kind of try to make up the gap. But they're still in a crisis until about September 1917. That's when the convoys become effective enough that the Germans are not sinking enough. It's not very clear that the U-boats are not sinking enough traffic to really affect the war. And then in May 1918,